Kia ora koutou. Thank you for tuning in. I'm John Lieswyn, the chair of Transportation Group New Zealand. Our group's beginnings reach back to the 1950s, and we were formally constituted in 1972. Now, with over 1,200 members, we represent transportation planners and engineers across government and the private sector. Our previous chair, Bridget Duran, initiated these podcasts, and you can find season 1 on Engineering New Zealand's YouTube page. Today, I'm pleased to interview Thomas Nash. Thomas is a regional councillor and transport chair for Greater Wellington Regional Council. He has a background in setting up and running organizations and political campaigns to achieve progressive change at local, national, and international levels. Before being elected as a regional councillor in 2019, Thomas spent 15 years overseas working on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. He's a chartered member of the Institute of Directors, serves on the board of directors of New Zealand Smart City Infrastructure Big Street Bikers, is an active member of the Green Party, and is a social entrepreneur and adjunct lecturer in politics at Massey University. Welcome, Thomas. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Friday.
Oh, hey, John. Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
So our topic today is transport in urban form, sharing space, giving people choice, and getting bang for infrastructure buck. You'll be highlighting important new research on the infrastructure costs of different urban form commissioned by Greater Wellington. What was the motivation behind getting this work done? And do you want to show us a little bit about it?
Yeah, there's a couple of slides in there if we go through to some of those graphs. Caitlin in the background. So we at Greater Wellington, we are responsible for the public transport in the region, so buses, trains, cross harbour ferries. But we also play a role in regional spatial planning, so figuring out where people should, where we should, as a region, decide to develop our kind of homes and our places of employment and how we should get around the region. And so I guess it's in that context really that we developed this work around the link between cost of infrastructure and urban development. And it's pretty striking. So you can see that graph right now. That graph there shows the marginal cost of an additional dwelling, the marginal fiscal cost of an additional dwelling, based on the infrastructure costs and determined by the density. So you can see on the blue, when you're in the blue bits of the bar graph, that's looking good, right? So the density, the higher the density, the lower the cost, essentially, for councils. The lower the density of new housing, the higher the cost. And this doesn't really get communicated or understood well. People sort of think, well, yeah, it's sort of cheap. It's cheap to build the actual house. You put up a wooden frame and you clad it and you put a roof on it, and there you go. But actually, if you think about the kind of linear cost of pipes for water, energy, roading, etc., the sprawling kind of suburbs, they do cost a lot more in infrastructure than high density housing. The next slide is quite good as well, because this actually maps specific locations in the Wellington region by density and cost of infrastructure, and you can see that Dixon Street, might be hard to see, I don't know, but Dixon Street right there on the kind of far edge, very low cost for infrastructure, because it's already got the infrastructure there, mostly in the central city of Wellington, and obviously very high density. Whereas, if you go further out to Riverstone Terraces and Upper Hutt, it costs a lot to get the infrastructure out there. So I think this doesn't get taken into account as much as it should, and it's kind of a no-brainer from an economic perspective, right? We have an infrastructure a set of infrastructure challenges where our infrastructure is getting older in New Zealand. It needs to be replaced, renewed. It needs to be maintained. That all costs money. We have a climate crisis where we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to reduce emissions and to set ourselves up to do that cheaply and cost effectively. And we also have a housing crisis where we don't have enough houses for people, and people end up paying too much in rent and so on, and they don't have anywhere decent to live. So if you want to address all of those things, then you need to pay attention to the cost of your infrastructure. And I think this research is designed to help inform decision makers, policy makers, etc., on the implications of their decisions around, say, town planning, urban development, infrastructure. Should we build a motorway, or should we invest more in public transport? I mean, these decisions have a huge impact on whether we're going to make progress on the challenges that we face around housing, around climate, and around renewing our infrastructure. So yeah, that's a little bit about where this all comes from.
Interesting. The findings of this report seem pretty obvious to transport professionals. In what way do these findings help move the needle towards better outcomes? Has there been to fellow councillors or other local authorities?
Yeah, I guess it's a good question. And you can, in the end, you need the evidence like this, but you also need to disseminate it, get it out there, and get people to engage with it and ask questions about it, share it with each other. So we hope that having the evidence there will help to make that happen. I mean, obviously we're doing this, so that's good. That's a good indication that there's some interest around some of this material. I've been writing about it online, and we had some, we've had some pieces in the newspaper, etc. Some media interest. We need to keep doing that. I guess there is interest as well from the development community, from private developers, etc. on this. There are different views depending on where those developers sit, depending on what land they already own, or what type of buildings they're interested in building. But yeah, I think that we're starting to see a bit of a shift. You've got organisations like the Infrastructure Commission that are doing similar sorts of investigations and providing similar advice. I think you'll see organisations like the Treasury and other big government agencies that will start to engage with this kind of research. Value for money is a big priority for this government. So if you want value for money, then look at this research and you will see where you can get the best bang for buck with your infrastructure dollar in your cities. I think one of the challenges is that there are a lot of competing priorities. So just to give an example, I think at the moment the overall transport policy of the government is working against the housing policy of the government. And that's a question for obviously the Prime Minister and the government ministers involved to come together and say, hang on a second, we need to make sure that our policies aren't working against each other, but are actually supporting a coherent approach to governing the country and solving the country's problems. So I think that this helps to make that point as well. There's another slide, possibly the next slide, that sets out if we skip through these ones, these are good though as well. This is another piece of research that looks at how we can redesign elements of our urban environment in order to get more density. If you keep going, I think it might be the next one. This one here. So this is again research by Sense Partners. Good set of economists if you need some research done. So this is looking at the emissions per person, the transport emissions by area of Wellington. So the lighter it is, the fewer emissions you're generating for transport. I mean, it kind of makes sense because obviously if you live near the central city, you can walk or easily bike. And the further out you get, the darker it gets, the more emissions you're generating by transport. I mean, this is the same. This is going to be the same for every city in the country. I mean, I just think having these things set out, it's like, okay, if you want to reduce emissions and you want to do it cheaply, actually transport is kind of one of the best ways to do it, as well as urban form, letting people live near the centre of the city where they actually want to live because it's close to where they work. That is going to help your housing problem. It's going to reduce your emissions, and it's going to be cheaper to do. So all of these things sort of make sense, but there are other kind of preconceived ideas and, I suppose, vested interests in other policy outcomes that we have to overcome, and we have to acknowledge those and confront them. But hopefully, this work starts to will start to help people to do that.
Well, if you show the previous slide, Caitlin, that one shows kind of what we as transport professionals often work with. This is something that you might see in a transport plan per se. How does this, how do you, when you're as a councillor and you're being presented with a plan like this, how does the economic research that we've been talking about today sort of back this up?
Yeah, I think that it's a good question, and I think they are slightly separate. The economic analysis, I've been focusing a lot on that, and asking the council to focus a lot on that recently, because we do have significant fiscal constraints, and I think that's the sort of economic zeitgeist, right, in the government right now. It's about reducing spending and value for money. So I think we need to be able to talk in those terms. But this point is really this slide, I think, makes the point about sharing space. So I think people don't sort of necessarily, your average person who maybe drives a private motor vehicle quite a lot, they don't necessarily think about the amount of space that is dedicated to them on the road compared to other users who might be wanting to use the road, and I think we sort of take for granted as people driving. I mean, I drive a lot every day. I mean, we sort of take for granted the fact that we've got essentially 90% of the public space of the road dedicated to us, and there's a tiny fraction dedicated to other users, people walking, biking, or maybe having a dedicated bus lane. So I think it's kind of unfair, and it's public space, right? I think this is the point about roads, that it's publicly owned space. It's like a library or a council pool. It's public space. It's owned by all of us. So if we dedicate it all to one particular mode, then we're massively privileging that mode, and we're doing that at the moment for private motor vehicles, and it's causing quite a lot of problems for people who want to use other modes and who might want to have a more efficient public transport network. In particular, we would like to see more bus lanes in the city. As the regional council, it would significantly improve the network efficiency for our bus networks if we could have more bus lanes. There have been some that have come in, and that's been really good. We need more, and both dedicated kind of at all times bus lanes, as well as peak only bus lanes, and we're working on that with the road controlling authorities, particularly Wellington City Council, where most of our buses are operating. So I think this is a good slide to make that point about sharing space.
So Thomas, you're on the Regional Transport Committee. How can we as planners and engineers respond to the imperatives of sensible urban form, like what you've been talking about, given that the government policy statement basically points the way to a future of more sprawl?
Yeah, I think the government, I think the point that I made earlier about the incoherence between government housing and urban development policy on the one hand and government transport policy, that's a good place to start. And I think when any of us are giving advice to whoever client we're working for, I think you've got to be honest about the incoherence and the additional costs that people are building into their projects, or the additional costs that people are going to be transferring to ratepayers in the future or taxpayers in the future by making certain decisions in the short term. I think it's good to be honest about those things. Obviously, there's a tension there, because if you've got a client who just wants a traffic management plan or whatever it is, a transport plan, to kind of fulfill their needs, to do what they want to do, then you're delivering that. Well, you deliver it because you're getting paid to deliver it. I understand that, but I do think I would hope that people see at least some sense of duty to point out the reality of what people are deciding to do, and also I think you can change people's minds as well with good evidence and good advice, and I think in the end we're for a city like Wellington, where I live, we're not going to be able to attract the talent, the business, the investment that we need to really flourish as a city if we don't confront the housing challenges that we have and the transport challenges that we have. People they'll vote with their feet. They'll go to another city that is building high quality apartments and dwellings close to the central city, that is investing in public transport and safe places to bike so people can get around easier and cheaper. That's where they'll go, because those cities will succeed. So I have confidence that Wellington will go in the right direction, but I think we all need to play our part in getting this message across to decision makers and particularly to central government, who I think have some baked in incoherence in their policy approach that we need to address.
Caitlin, if you'll go back to the slide that shows the blue and pink bars.
The first slide, this one, this one here, this is a good slide.
It's a good intro to a question I've got, and it's my last question actually, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But you told me before the podcast that one of the origins of this research was actually a developer. So that leads to my question. We often default to regulatory approaches to getting better transport in urban form. But to what extent do you think the market, meaning the banks and developers, investors, need to hear these messages contained in the research? And if you think,
I think it's very important. And
how do we reach them?
Well, I think we reach them by, I guess, digesting this information ourselves, understanding it, and then talking to all of our friends and family and colleagues and clients and so on about it. I mean, that's the way any kind of message gets across, is through conversations and so on. So we need to do that. And if you've got a particular voice, through your organisation or through your social media following or whatever, then you can use that too, and that's important. But so this slide here comes from Also Sense Partners document that was commissioned by the Wellington company. So Ian Castles, who is a significant property developer in Wellington, focusing on intensification and townhouses and so on, taller buildings. So he wanted to show that actually for the council, if the council was concerned, if a city council was concerned about rates going up and is also concerned about getting more housing, then it needs to think about where it incentivizes development. Does it incentivize sprawling greenfields development, or does it incentivize high density development within the city? And this graph shows pretty clearly that if your concern is to prevent rates from going too high, then you would absolutely prioritize intensification and deprioritize sprawling greenfields infrastructure. One of the problems is that quite a lot of the greenfields land that is already zoned in Wellington, it's owned by one or two families, right? One or two groups, and they already bought it. They bought it for basically nothing. So, and they've just been sitting on it, and they have a very low cost to develop that land, and it sort of makes it artificially cheaper to put that housing there, and then you end up with the infrastructure costs being passed on to people in the future. And you can see how that happens from this graph, right? It's just going to go on to rates because they're never going to recover enough of the cost to build the linear infrastructure for water and roads.
So are development contributions too low then?
Well, I think for greenfields they probably are. And again, I think, but again, I think there's like you could also do it through targeted rates. So I think the development contributions, that's kind of an upfront cost for the developer, and then targeted rates would be a kind of paying off the cost of the infrastructure over time. I mean, I think you need both. I think we've probably had too much focus on development contributions, particularly, I mean, in the inner city suburbs. I think you could maybe what I would do is I would increase the development contributions for greenfields on the basis that they have a higher upfront cost of infrastructure per additional dwelling, and I would put a higher targeted rate on those homes that are in that area, because to compensate for the fact that the cost of that infrastructure is going to be borne over a longer period of time by the council. And then I would probably do the opposite for the central city, where you would possibly have maybe lower development contributions to encourage and incentivize housing development in the central city, recognizing that it then reduces transport costs, reduces emissions, reduces the cost of infrastructure overall, and probably you'd have a lower targeted rate in the central city as well. So I think that's how I would do it, rather than, you don't want to put everything on development contributions, because that's going to make it harder to actually get the development happening with the housing. I think you need to use both those tools, and you need to modulate them depending on where you want to encourage the housing, which you should base on what the actual costs are for society, for the council, for ratepayers, for renters, etc. over time. And it's pretty obvious where the costs fall.
Yeah. Certainly in my area in Canterbury, most young families are moving out to Rolleston. So ever since the Southern Motorway was put in, it's easy to get from there to your job in Central City. But people aren't thinking about the impacts on others, older neighborhoods through which they then have to drive, or their transport costs.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's essentially because the land was cheap, right? And then the land was subsidized. The development of the land was subsidized with a state highway, or presumably it's the state highway that goes to Rolleston. And so that's like, so I'm, you and me are paying for that through our taxes. I mean, I don't even live in Canterbury, but I'm paying for the state highway. So it's like, great, where you have these inner city suburbs that are subsidizing the development of sprawling greenfield developments, whose costs are going to be borne over a long period of time. And we're just talking about the infrastructure costs here, right? The linear costs, eroding of water, of energy, etc. But there's other costs that don't even get factored in at all, like the environmental costs. So what is the cost of converting vegetation to impervious surfaces, concrete, etc., and housing? I mean, it's quite significant, right, in terms of the cost on biodiversity, the cost on freshwater ecosystem health. Those costs, they're actually factored nowhere. So who's going to pay for that? Well, it ends up being often the regional councils that have to pay for it, and so then it comes back again across the ratepayers, or it doesn't get paid for, and it just degrades, and then you have a degraded environment that nobody has paid for, and I guess these are some of the considerations that I think we need to bring together if you wanted a kind of coherent approach to urban development, transport, and environment policy.
I'm going to open it up now to participants. We've got 5 minutes remaining. So just type your Q&A or your questions into the Q&A panel. And I'll hopefully, if the technology works, be able to read them off. So this question is, to what extent are other cities and regions taking into account the fiscal impact of the new housing zoning policies? Or are you suggesting, Thomas, that here's a model, you should do it too? Well,
I do think that this model should be, I think the the work that Greater Wellington has done with Sense Partners on infrastructure costs per dwelling by type of urban form, by density, etc. I think you probably need to do that over all of the Tier 1 councils in New Zealand. I haven't seen it. This is the first time I've seen it done for any Tier 1 region. I think you need to do it everywhere, and then you need to apply it. I think the answer to that question is I don't think they are really. Unfortunately, I think if they did, then we would see different policies. But yeah, it can be done. Like I said, it's not, people can put in targeted rates. They can increase development contributions based on the real costs. It just takes some economic analysis, then some policy, and then you do it.
Great. Just a quick question. The slides that we skipped over are the ones that showed the different types of development. Caitlin, would you put one of those on the screen?
Yeah, we can. I can share that. So this is also, if you Google GWRC Urban Design Toolkit, you'll see the report that these slides are taken from, and that's a report that was released a week or two ago, produced by WSP, and that was essentially to look at, okay, what does it actually look like if we want to change our existing urban environment from a single site to a kind of street to a neighborhood to an urban center. Those 4 scenarios were explored, and some kind of these diagrams are taken from the report, but essentially it's a really good report that is tailored to the Wellington region, and it's designed for a kind of non-expert housing urban planning audience, and it shows you how the change might look, because I think that's what's been missing a bit, is that we talk about intensification and urban development, and people think it's going to be bad, it's going to look bad, I'm going to have no sun, these houses are going to be terribly designed, and there's going to be no green space, and so on and so forth. But actually that's not the case, and there's lots of really good examples around the world, and even in New Zealand, of good urban design that has intensified an area without making it worse, and in fact by making it better. So yeah, good. We can share these slides. Yeah,
we've got 2 minutes left and 2 questions, so you'll have to answer them in about 40 seconds each. So what do you think about the Paddington development on Taranaki Street? A lost opportunity with far lower density than possible?
Yes, absolutely. 100% agree. Next.
Okay. And do you think that the increase in development contribution fees will be passed on to end users by developers? That means the house buyers. And how can you be sure that the increased development contribution fees will be used for infrastructure instead of ineffective policies?
Yeah, I think you can address that with some of the specific way that you design the policy around development contributions, but also, again, I think targeted rates for high cost infrastructure developments are also a good way to do that as well. And if people know upfront that there's going to be a targeted rate attached to this because it's greenfields, then that'll affect the price of the place as well.
We've got one more question and enough time to answer it, I think. Actually, there's a flood of questions coming in now, but this one's very
that's okay.
Is amending the Local Government Act an option to require councils to more explicitly consider the economics of development?
Could be. Yep, you could do that. I mean, there could be other ways that are simpler as well. But yeah, yep. I haven't thought of all the policy avenues for this, but I think, yeah, you could look at that.
Excellent. It's now going on 1 o'clock. I just want to thank you for your time, Thomas. It's been incredibly interesting. And I want to thank you all for tuning in, and have a great afternoon.
Cool. Thanks.